Hi, I'm really excited to have Scott Newstok here for our series of talks on drama and the public good. Scott is professor of English at Rhodes College, and he's the author of a really beautiful new book. It's called How to Think Like Shakespeare, Lessons from a Renaissance Education. And I think anyone who's interested in the history of education, in the purposes of the liberal arts, and also in the nature of poetic creativity should really read this book. It's really nicely organized as a set of short chapters on a whole bunch of topics or key words from Renaissance educational theory and practice. So there's things like of thinking, of craft, of place, of attention, of making, one of my favorites, of conversation, of constraint, and also of freedom. And the organization makes it really easy to kind of dip into this book as you want. I read it cover to cover, but you don't have to. You can really read it for sustenance and for nourishment, like a snack or a short meal. These chapters are also built out of quotations and reflections from a whole bunch of writers. So there's a lot of Shakespeare in here, but you will also have Bob Dylan and James Baldwin and Cicero and Hannah Arendt and many, many more. So you come away feeling really enriched and enlightened and also excited to go back to these classic writers or to read them for the first time with the tools in hand that Scott has given you. So Scott, welcome to UCI's New Swan Shakespeare Center. We're so happy to have you with us. Since your book is so literary, I thought that we could start out by you're just reading a little bit from the book and then telling us about the compositional process.
Thanks, Julia. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you. I guess I could start just briefly with the compositional process before I give you the excerpt, in part based on what you were just saying, that it's a book full of quotations. And I feel like I've come to realize belatedly that it's a very booky book, that it's thick with passages from others, it's thick with epigraphs and footnotes and other kind of apparatus of the material book, and that stages its own dialogue with other writers and with other thinkers. So as you hinted, the compositional process was very much in the spirit of the kind of commonplacing practices of early modern writers. I was really gathering everything I loved about thinking and about teaching and education and trying to find some way to weave all of that together. It does make choosing an excerpt a little bit difficult because I don't know yet how to speak a footnote in the middle of a passage that's a digressive side comment on the thing that I was just reading. So I thought instead what I would do for an excerpt would be to do something based on where I am right now, which is camping with my family in remote northern Minnesota. And there's a passage on page 29 that I think is pertinent. So here's the passage. This is from the chapter on craft, which you alluded to as well. My friend John Latimer spent his career documenting seasonal changes to flora and fauna along his rural postal delivery route in northern Minnesota. His notebooks, spanning 4 decades, track animal migrations, seasonal flowering, changes in the weather. These phenological notes are now being studied by Harvard scientists for evidence of climate change, and the principal investigator of a multi-million-dollar Oak Ridge National Laboratory project had the good sense to overlook what others might have dismissed as John's so-called lack of advanced degrees, and hired him on account of extraordinary depth of domain knowledge, that is, knowledge in the field. In short, making is thinking, or as the editors of the 1623 Folio praise Shakespeare, his mind and hand went together. Don't you want yours to go together too? This kind of mindful making applies to everything from a physical object to a philosophical argument. Craft is both cognitive and embodied, as in George Hale's 1614 Sword Manual, which praises how the feet labor equally with the hands, the eye and the judgment walk together. So I guess I just make one comment about the way that was typical, I think, of the book, is that I do try to weave personal anecdotes with that I think are in alignment with early modern practices and educational and craft practices throughout history. And it does mean that I flit from passage to passage fairly quickly, but I also hope that that's a brisk, engaging way that that opens the possibility for someone picking up the book as a kind of snack, as you mentioned.
Beautiful. I just love that. So, as someone who has written myself on design, I was really, really taken by your chapters on craft and on making. And you tell some interesting stories in there about gloves and glove making. Of course, Shakespeare's father was a glove maker, and the role that craft played in the life of Shakespeare. Can you share some of that with us?
So as you're asking that question, Julia, it makes me think back to the blog that you used to run about maybe 15 or so years ago, Design Your Life blog, which then led eventually to the book that you co-authored with your sister, Ellen. And what I liked, among many things I liked about the blog, one of the things I loved was that sense of design that suffused everything from physical arrangements of an object in a room to more kind of conceptual or temporal arrangements of your life, in thinking of a schedule of activities for your family. And one of the main conceits of the book is in a similar spirit, which is that craft is a good way to think about all kinds of making and activity within our lives. We tend to associate craft with physical activity, but I think if we recognize the features that craft practice entails, it actually is a really good description for how intellectual practice happens and develops as well. And I certainly think it's a more honest and more effective way to describe education than a kind of our current skills-based discourse. It feels more holistic and comprehensive and dynamic and humane, really, than a kind of more fractured sense of skills that tends to dominate the way we talk about education now. So, I do linger with thinking through the Glover's Workshop and other artisanal household workshops that would have been the initial places that young boys would have encountered certain kinds of craft practices before they were schooled in the tutor classroom, and then try to think through, or I try to draw upon ways in which some of those emulated practices in the theater or practices in the publishing, printing industry, drawing on a lot of other scholars who have done great work over the last few decades doing that very work, but trying to distill it and make it accessible for a more general audience.
Beautiful. I loved it. It really made me feel like I could, feel those gloves and imagine how they would change, how I use my hands and how I touch
Good.
things. And so it was very, very, very vivid.
Oh, great.
A lot of this book is about teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And we've both been teaching for a long time, and you're very uncomfortable in the book. Well, that's maybe not the right word. You defend traditional forms of humanistic teaching and literary education that focus on proximity, on close reading, on the relationship of the teacher to the student. And that means that you have some very critical things to say about remote teaching and online teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this was composed before the coronavirus pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
when so many of us were made to teach remotely. So I was curious if you could share with us whether your thoughts about online teaching have changed as a result of the virus, where you are with that issue right now.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it was at first I was, everybody was upset by the transition to remote teaching or disoriented by it at least. And it did seem like a really poor time to be bringing out a book that had a pretty strong argument against the aspects of online teaching that I don't think are favorable. So I guess I have a kind of two-part response to that fact of our lives right now. One is that I think that the experience for many students and teachers confirmed some of the things that I was saying, or that many people have been saying about some of the limitations of remote fora. Just one example that I kept on hearing from my students was and my advisees as well, was the general lack of motivation and feeling somewhat disenchanted and uncertain about how to proceed. And in a way, I feel like being forced into that environment helped remind us of maybe some superficially banal things, but actually very profound things, like being in a room with other people does force you to be accountable in a kind of way that is less less immediately available in some of the online exchanges.
I think one of our challenges as we, try to integrate these technologies is figuring out how to create relationality. The face-to-face quality of Zoom that we're experiencing right now is potentially empowering.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can also create, and I've tried doing this with some of my own online teaching, trying to create exercises that address students as makers and craftspeople and that train attention in various ways, kind of getting away from the midterm and the final.
Yes.
And producing sort of craft-oriented projects that encourage interaction.
So what can I have? I'm eager to learn. I'm all ears right now. What's a good example of something that's really worked well for you to get that participatory sense?
I developed one project called Production Notebook, and the students have to come up with a production idea for whatever play that we're reading, and they have to curate images that communicate the tone and the atmosphere of their production. But they also have to choose quotations from the play and then comment on those quotations. So they're doing it's kind of a commonplacing.
Right.
It's both design work and commonplacing, and they're getting a lot of the same skills that they would from writing a paper. But each one is distinct, each one is different. We do a lot of pre-writing so that the relationship, or I'd say like pre-project work, so that the relationality comes out of the groups and the faculty and TA responds to the project ideas. Students really are learning from each other's projects because they're having to comment on it. So I found that has been a satisfying way to create a sort of a meaningful online environment that incorporates some of the values of the Renaissance education as you describe it, including the crafting and the commonplacing.
I might end up stealing that, and I'll have to credit you as the inspiration for that. But no, I've been stymied in the transition, and I need to think harder about ways to make the best of the circumstances.
And what you've created is really, again, very beautiful. And I think one of the virtues that you demonstrate in this would be like intellectual friendship. The way in which you develop kind of friendship with the great tradition that you're involved, as Montaigne and Shakespeare were, you're involved in a conversation with the writers that you're reading, and you talk about conversation as a value. And even when you're mounting an argument, let's say, about remote learning, you're doing it in a way which is very inviting and hospitable, and I think makes everyone feel at home in this very warm discourse that you're building. So it's really a tremendous achievement. I think it's a model for the kind of writing I'd love to see more of in our fields. I'd love to see this kind of willingness to read all these different authors and bring them into one conversation about education. And I think your students must be very lucky to be in your seminars and see Shakespeare as part of this very diverse and vibrant world of craft and freedom. And
thank you.
And all of it. So
that's very generous. That's incredibly gratifying. That's exactly what I was trying to do. I mean, it's not without its risks, because it does leap around a lot chronologically or even achronologically, and there's other shortcomings. If you're reading it through a lens of an academic monograph, it doesn't look like one. But we
have lots of those, and we only have one book like this. So we're very lucky.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us from Minnesota, and I hope that we'll have more conversations in the future.
Likewise.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.